Herm Gailey here to talk about bits again, this time about tongue relief bits. You hear a lot of people talking about tongue relief. It seems to be a moving target of the definition for some people. There are those who think it is absolutely necessary to relieve pressure on a horse's tongue. I'm not really of that school of thought. I think some tongue relief is good on some horses. It's very horse specific. Let's briefly consider the horse's tongue. We know where it is. It's in his mouth unless he's sticking it out, unless he's licking you or a playmate for fun. His tongue lies in between the two arcades of lower teeth, basically just a bit above. It will be just a bit above in most horses of the tooth line, we'll call it. So that it does protrude up into an area where a bit can impact it. It is a long, muscular, important organ that helps them with eating. It helps them with gathering food. It helps them with moving food around in their mouth as they eat. It helps them with swallowing. For that reason, the tongue tends to be very mobile, and that can become an issue when we put a bit in the horse's mouth. There are a couple of anatomic features that really make a difference in dealing with or considering the tongue. One is different horses have different degrees of fleshiness or bulk to their tongue. So there are some horses that literally have fatter tongues, thicker tongues. You'll see that a lot in the more cold-blooded horses, horses with some draft, old school foundation quarter horses, whereas thoroughbreds, warm bloods pretty much, I think, and certainly the more current race bred or performance bred quarter horses have thinner tongues, which may be more sensitive, but which are not going to intrude into the space used by the bit nearly as much. There's a second element too, and that is different horses have different anatomy of the roof of their mouth or their palate. So a horse with a thick tongue and a low palate is going to have less room to accommodate a bit and is more likely to need a bit that provides some tongue relief. So what are we talking about when we talk about tongue relief? Well, I will tell you that you can go to virtually any tack shop that you want, online or brick and mortar, and find very, very few true, complete tongue relief bits. There's a reason for that, and we'll go into that later. But I do have one. This is an old bit that I don't use much. It's not a particularly good bit, but it fit a need I had for a horse that had a profoundly damaged tongue. Because that's another thing to consider with a horse is, do they have any damage to their tongue that would make them unusually sensitive? This particular horse had come from a pretty tough school, really a good horse. But if you looked in his mouth, you could see that his tongue was only about maybe 1/3 to 40% attached. And on the one side, it was completely lacerated and interrupted. So obviously, a bit that lay on that area of the tongue, which it was right where a bit would lie because a bit caused it, no doubt, that was very uncomfortable and disturbing to him. So I would ride him for the most part in a hackamore, but when I wanted to show him, because he was an aged horse, you had to show him a bit, and this is what I went to. And you can see that this bit has a lot of room that can accommodate basically the whole tongue, which might only be as wide as my 3 fingers there. So with the flexibility of the tongue, it'll just slip up in there without any trouble. And it completely relieves the tongue. This is a true, complete tongue relief bit. And it worked real well on that horse. He accepted it. He was no longer apprehensive. He did not like carrying a bit as much as the typical horse. So I rode him a lot in a hackamore. But to show him and to tune him up for a show, this was a bit that I could go to that was true tongue relief. To understand tongue relief, we need to look at the opposite. So here is a bit descriptively enough referred to as a straight bar. It has a tiny bit of what they call a mullen or a curve to it, but it's virtually a straight bar. When that bears down, it bears down equally on the tongue and the bars. So you're getting a very equal pressure. Some horses like that. I don't find that a complete straight bar is particularly well tolerated. It's not something that I use. This bit hasn't been on a bridle for a long time, but I did have it and I used it on a horse that just liked that sort of global pressure on her mouth. So you can see if my tongue here is a good representation, there's virtually no relief under it. Despite that little bit of mullen, the tongue is going to be impacted by this bit no matter where you put it. So why don't we all just use pure tongue relief bits? Because arguably, a horse's tongue is the most sensitive part of their mouth. And there are people who really believe that to be the case. I think it's more horse specific. Some horses are more sensitive in the bars, some horses more sensitive in the tongue. Typically they are less sensitive in the lips than either of those other two places. The bars, of course, just to review, is the space between the teeth where the bit will have contact. And every bit, with the exception of snaffles, is going to have some degree of bar contact, and even some snaffles can impact the bar. Now, while this is great to relieve pressure on the tongue, it comes at a price. Where does it go? That pressure has to go somewhere when you compress the bit and take a hold with the chin chain or chin strap. Where does it go? It goes to the bars. And there's no way to completely relieve the pressure on both the bars and the tongue. So you go from the tongue, which may be oversensitive in a particular horse, and which is sensitive in every type of horse, to one that puts pressure not on the tongue, but on the bars, which may not be the most sensitive part of the mouth, that's arguable, but it is probably the most fragile. The flesh on the bars of a horse's mouth is most like the flesh on our shins. Think how thin that is, and like our shins, the bar underneath that limited soft tissue cushioning is absolutely thin, fragile bone that can easily be damaged. So you are really dealing with the most fragile part of the horse's mouth, and transmitting all that force to that area is not always wise, which is why you don't see that many pure, complete tongue relief bits. You'll see varying degrees, but you don't often see a bit that is just a big U here for the tongue to sneak up in. One thing that is worth mentioning is you have to remember that this looks like a great way for a tongue to disappear into a bit, but that is not how the bit is going to hang in the horse's mouth. Even when it's activated, it's probably not going to rotate that far back. The tongue is going to be more like this, so that it has to go up into this U-shaped port when it's not completely in its most accessible. So part of the way. And it'll fold up in there, but it's not quite as easy as just running it up in that. It's just a fact of life that even a bit like this isn't as complete a tongue relief as it might appear because of the way the bit actually works in the horse's mouth. So what are other options? You don't want complete tongue relief, but you need to give the horse some relief from that pressure that he doesn't like, or that he just wants to play with. You know, our tongues we use and horses use to move food around, we also use it to explore our mouth. If you put something you didn't mean to, if you put a dime in your mouth, the first thing that would move it around and locate it would be your tongue. A few months ago, we were on vacation. As is a rule in life, if you're going to break a tooth, you're going to do it when you're away from home. I fractured a tooth. It was sharp, it wasn't painful, but I could not talk my tongue out of exploring that until it was completely lacerated from probing that space, that sharp space that had been created. That's one of the things a horse will do. Put that bit in a certain horse's mouth, and if they're what you would think of as an inquisitive tongued horse, they're going to be piddling with it the whole time. So that's another thing to consider. So you want to give them some tongue relief. Here's a nice bit. This is a Greg Darnell bit or a Ray Mayhew bit. I've used it so much for so long that the maker's mark is just worn off. And those guys had a very similar style. You can see that this gives a fair amount of tongue relief. There's enough room for a tongue to slip up in there, because remember, you don't have to accommodate the whole tongue. You really only have to accommodate the width of the tongue and the portion of the height of the tongue that extends above the arcade of teeth. So that makes a nice little amount of tongue relief that can let the whole tongue escape. There's much more tongue relief in this bit than meets the eye. Certainly, if you compare this bit, which is referred to as a Mullen mouthpiece, with this straight bar, there's a huge difference. And the difference is a place for the tongue to go. So there's going to be some tongue pressure, but it's going to be less. And the other thing that makes this a particularly good bit is if you look here, that is not a straight bar over to this Mullen. It's a gradual incline, so that it gradually works across the bars instead of just bearing down like a crowbar. So that's an alternative way to provide tongue relief. Then there are other bottles, and this one is a Greg Darnell. This is a medium port, and a horse can get a lot of relief from this type of port, but nowhere near the amount of relief you would get with this type of port when you compare the anatomy of the bits and think about the anatomy of the tongue. Nonetheless, this does give you some tongue relief, and it's a pretty good all-around bit. It gives you some room. It flirts with palate pressure depending on how you have your chin strap adjusted. So you're going to get pressure several different places and not so much on the tongue. Now, you also have bits that provide varying degrees of tongue relief. Now recall, if you have a port in your bit, it can only provide tongue relief if this isn't sealed off in any way. So if you have that bar going across and a port extending off a straight bar, you're not going to get tongue relief. So let me show you two bits, and I'm going to turn this into a Q&A, and I'm going to ask the Q's. So here is a half-breed bit. This is actually a bit in Bob Avila's collection that he made. He came up with a lot of great older traditional bits and essentially had them mass produced so that people could afford them. Are they as high a quality as a bit you get from a custom maker? No. But do they allow the likes of us to access these things at a price point we can live with? They do. So I'm a fan of these bits. So this is a half-breed, and you can see that instead of running the bar the whole way across and extending the port off that, this slopes up to the port and provides some tongue relief. So I just blew the question because I was going to ask you if this does provide some tongue relief. But Having leaked that, you can see that it does. Now, maybe I should have gone to teacher's college because this Q&A stuff is throwing me off. How about this one? Tongue relief or not? Let me know. You know, you've got a port, you've got a bar, it's a pretty straight bar. This is also a form of half-breed. This is a real old bit. They still make them. It's called a Visalia Humane bit. And an old friend gave it to me and he said, you're gonna have a horse that won't get along with any other bit. This thing might just work when that happens. And I've used this on a couple of horses that were real strong and it's worked out real well. Don't use it a lot. It's a little different style than what I typically use. But that's a Visalia Humane. Does it give tongue relief? So those are some thoughts on tongue relief. Tongue relief is good. It doesn't have to be total. If it is total, particularly if it's total, it comes at a price because you transmit the forces that would have been absorbed by the spongy, nice, soft tongue over to those fragile bars. So don't trade in, as I used to say, don't trade a headache for an upset stomach. Don't take a horse that has no problem with his bars, but get him oversensitized by putting pressure on it that you don't need to. I don't think I've ever made a bit video that I didn't say this. With the exception of the horse with a damaged tongue, it's really as much about the other end of the bridle, the other end of the reins, what's going on here. Because there are people who can ride a real sensitive horse with a great big bit and it just gets nicer and nicer. And other people get on with a big, soft bit and terrorize the horse. Don't be the second guy. But that's tongue relief. Till next time.